Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IAC Culture Talks series. I'm Professor Jing Han, the Director of the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the grammatical people of the Darug Nation, whose ancestors have been the traditional owners of their land for thousands of years, and I pay our respect to the First Nations elders, past and present. Today, we are thrilled to have finally Professor Fran Martin of Melbourne University to give this talk on After the Dream, tracking the post-study lives of Chinese women graduates of Australian universities. Such an interesting topic, especially after our recently held Australian-China Transcultural Studies Symposium and the Foundation for Australian Studies in China conference. It is a topic that many researchers are interested in and many people can relate to as well. Professor Martin is a professor of cultural studies and head of the Screen and Cultural Studies program in the School of Culture and Communication and co-convener of the Asian Cultural Research Hub at the University of Melbourne. She previously lectured in cinema studies at La Trobe University from 2000 to 2003. Professor Martin is fluent in Mandarin, having begun learning Chinese in primary school in Australia. She later spent 2 years studying Chinese language and literature at the Beijing Second Foreign Languages Institute, Bei-Er-Wai, now Beijing International Studies University, and East China Normal University, 1989 to 1991. She then spent a further 2 years researching in Taiwan, including at National Taiwan Central University's Center for the Study of Sexualities. Professor Martin's best-known research focuses on television, film, literature, and other forms of cultural production in contemporary transnational China, including mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and the worldwide Chinese diaspora, with a specialization in transnational flows and representations and cultures of gender and sexuality. In 2021, she completed an ARC Future Fellowship project exploring the subjective experiences of young women from China studying in Australia. Its findings were published in 2022 in the book called Dreams of Flight, The Lives of Chinese Women Students in the West. Her early books include Telemodernities, Television and Transforming Selfhood in Asia, Backward Glances, Contemporary Chinese Cultures and the Female Homoerotic Imaginary, and Situating Sexualities, Queer Representation in Taiwanese Fiction, Film, and Public Culture. At the end of the lecture, we will take questions from the audience. So please post your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and I will collect them for Professor Martin to respond at the end of the talk. So now please welcome Professor Fran Martin to give her lecture.
Thank you, Professor Jing Han. And I'd like to begin by thanking you and the IAC Culture Talk series generally for so kindly welcoming me here to speak with you today. I'm particularly excited about this talk because I'm going to be presenting some work that's still in progress and it's not finished. You might notice that in the way that I'm talking about, particularly in the second half of the talk. So I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. What I'd like to do now is share my screen. Hopefully everyone will be able to see this. And these are my slides that I'm going to be speaking to as we continue through the next 45 minutes or so. So today I'm speaking with you all about a study that is still in progress. And as you can see, the title is After the Dream, Tracking the Post-Study Lives of Chinese women graduates of Australian universities. This slide that you see here, which is the publicity image for this talk as well, is a obviously anonymized photograph. I talk of about half of the study participants, some of whose stories I'm going to be speaking about in this talk. So before I tell you about the study, I want to just look a little bit at the context of a study like this. So the graphs that you see on the left-hand side of the screen over here tell us something about the absolute numbers of Chinese student enrollments in Australian education through to 2022. So these numbers are obviously a bit old. If we were to look at more recent numbers, we'd see them rising up again. Since 2008, every year we have welcomed more than 100,000 students from the People's Republic of China to study in Australia. And as of July 2023, we can see China remains the leading nation of our international student cohort in general, even though the numbers from India and Nepal particularly are continuing to grow. We all know this. Certainly anyone who works in an Australian university can hardly be, or studies in one, can hardly be unaware of these facts and the sheer numbers of young people from China coming to Australia to work with us. But there's a couple of things that we don't know, in my view, enough about. The first one is this gender perspective. It is not a widely known fact that, in fact, a majority of Chinese students studying abroad in general, including in Australia, are female. In Australia, depending on which state we look at, it's somewhere between 51, 52 and 55, 56%, according to what we know, are women students. So that's already a majority, right? But if we look at the generation into which these women were born, my cohort was born around about 1990, we see that male births actually dominated female births by about 113 to 100. So in other words, we'd expect there to be more men than women reflected in the numbers that study in Australia. But no, women are in fact significantly more likely to study abroad. I've calculated very roughly about 30% more likely to study abroad than men. So I was wondering, why would this be? Number one. And for me, even more interestingly, what difference will being seen as in a female role make to their Australian study experience? Why will gender matter? How will it shape their experience? So that's the first context. The second one is that we know something about concrete facts, empirical facts about things like employment outcomes for our international graduates. What jobs do they get? How many of them get jobs? Where do they go? Where are these jobs? These kind of facts. But we don't know very much about the rest of their lives. How do they feel about themselves? What is their sense of identity? How does Australian study impact on their broader life plans and their broader sense of identity? How, in short, does Australian education affect Chinese women graduates over the longer term? And these two contexts then, the post-study knowledge gap and the neglected perspective of gender, are some of the things that motivated my study. So the study itself, I'll give you a very brief introduction here. As I said, it is going through 3 phases. Phase 1 was a pilot study in 2012, simple interviews with 15 participants, quite in-depth interviews, but only 15 of them. Phase 2 was the biggest one. This was where I was very lucky and very grateful to be supported by an Australian Research Council fellowship to undertake full-time research for over 5 years with a major ethnographic study of 56 participants, 50 core participants, including 6 same ones from the pilot study. I've followed them, 30 of them, from China to Melbourne. I met them in China before they came to Australia, came to Melbourne. I recorded interviews with them over the next 4 to 5 years. I also hung around with them informally, as we do in ethnographic practice, to become part of their lives and to observe their lives. I organized regular group activities for them. I undertook what we call digital ethnography. That is, I followed their social media and I interacted with them on social media. And sometimes I asked them to do things like take photographs of their lives or draw me maps of their lives. So I solicited their cultural production. All of that resulted in the publication of the book that Professor Jinghan has mentioned, Dreams of Flight, in 2022. We're now in phase 3, and I'm conducting follow-up interviews with the same participants, 34 of them, across these years of 2023 to 2026, again supported by the Australian Research Council in a smaller grant, 2 lots of interviews, as well as ongoing digital ethnography. By the way, I hope you like the photograph on this slide. This is a photograph I took during the pilot study phase. This is the wall of one of my interviewees' rooms in Melbourne, and I thought it was very lyrical, almost poetic, in the way it weaves together elements of her family and friends in China in the physical letters that they were still exchanging, Australian flags, some Chinese lanterns, and this map, Create Your Own Journey. This participant's mother was a travel agent, and she had given her this map. And I thought it was it almost like encapsulated something that I wanted to study, this whole collage here that we see. So I like that image. Here's just a couple of snapshots from field work during the middle phase of the study. You can see we hung out. This is an activity I organized with participants. We had a barbecue in the city centre. This is an activity organised by participants. They invited me to participate in with them. We spent the day celebrating the end of exams in a park in northern Melbourne, and so on. These are the kinds of moments of hanging out that gave me such rich data in that study. This, by the way, is a couple of participants taking photographs of, you may recognise, the University of Melbourne, beautiful old architecture there, which they were very interested in. They weren't studying at that university, but we had an activity on campus and they thought, oh, that's an interesting thing. Let's take a picture. So a bit of social background about that also informs really the reason for doing this study. Even before starting the research, I knew from my research into contemporary Chinese society and the works of other scholars that there's a couple of contradictory discourses or contradictory ways of thinking that are affecting the current generation of middle-class urban women. On the one hand, since the post-1978 market reforms and the end of the so-called Iron Rice Bowl era, and the state's withdrawal from some areas of social service, everybody in Chinese society is encouraged to rely on themselves, right? We must be strong. We must advance ourselves in this competitive market society. We must, in a way, govern our own lives, make rational choices to maximize our benefit to ourselves. We must become independent. We must not rely on the government. We must not rely on anybody else but ourselves. So this produces a certain version of the ideal person or the ideal subject of this society, which appeals not just to men, but to urban middle-class women, particularly those in the only child generations as well, because they've had concentrated family resources invested in them. They're encouraged to get a good education, imagine themselves having a career, imagine themselves becoming independent, and to become independent and to rely on themselves to some degree, particularly in their youth. So this is what sociologists would call a version of female individualization, where everybody, including women in this case, is encouraged to rely on oneself and, in a way, less on the family, less on the collective, and more on the self. But at the same time, there's a contradictory other discourse, which is what I'm calling neo-traditionalist femininity, whereby the state in the current era supports the idea of an essential, almost biologically determined difference between men and women. In some sense, some sociologists have argued this is taking back, rolling back the Mao era gender equality ideal. Women are seen as naturally family and children centered. They're encouraged to go back to the family in times of rising urban unemployment. The standard script is rigidly enforced, where you're supposed to get married and have children before you turn 30. This horrible term, leftover women, or 剩女, is promulgated. In fact, the first time it was promulgated, I understand, was by the All China Women's Federation, ironically, Fulian, suggesting that if you're not married by 27 to 30, you're leftover. So this relates to material circumstances of the growing gender wage gap, women's decreasing employment participation, particularly married women, and increasing gender discrimination by employers. So in other words, as these young women navigate their 20s, they're bound to feel contradicted, because they were told they should be like this one, independent, relying on themselves, well-educated, having a career, etc. But then suddenly no, it's time for you to start thinking about marriage and focusing more on the family. So that's that contradiction. And I was wondering what would happen when you take, in a sense, you take them, or they've taken themselves out of the Chinese social context right at this time, right around somewhere between 17 and 24 years old, and spend several years out of that context in another country. How will that affect the way they navigate this contradiction, right? That's one of the big motivations for my study. So let's take a look at the key findings. Spoiler alert, if you read the book, there's a lot of other conclusions as well, and a lot of very rich data in there, I hope you'll find. But one of the key findings by the end of the book is that, well, what's the impact of studying in Australia on these women? A big one is that it strengthens their attachment to the first of those ideals I just showed you, the global, which is to some extent a globally relevant ideal of the mobile market subject, self-reliant, etc. And it weakens their attachment to that neo-traditionalist view of femininity that is supported by the Chinese state and much of Chinese public culture and family culture. So they get more like the first one and they start to like the second one less. That's one of the key findings of the book. So let me just briefly talk you through how I found that, because that sounds like a very big statement to make. And this is going to be quick because this is reprising the previous study before I get to the new one. But one of the aspects of that change is in the final round of interviews I did with participants just after their graduation, they spoke in all of the terms you see on the screen here about an increased self-focus, whether that's living life in your own way, living out my own self, living for yourself, living more self-centeredly, living to become yourself and not deferring to others, and so on. So again, that independent, somewhat individualized view. Secondly, they saw themselves more than before as proactive, as ambitious, as self-confident in the pursuit of goals and striving to grasp every opportunity to improve their market value by their own efforts. So I've taken one example here from an interview I did with somebody that I'm calling Shang. Of course, all of these participants are anonymized. This is not their real names. She says students who've studied overseas may be a bit more self-confident. They'll know what they want. They'll know, like she herself, that unless you're proactive, you might not get an opportunity. And she talks about how she sent her CV out everywhere, went around saying, could you look at my CV? Proactively made contact with HR departments, said, could I have an opportunity with you? I mean, I made myself more and more into a proactive person. Through this self-training overseas, I've been able to make myself more independent. I've gone more in that direction, proactively develop myself. And she thought all of those who went abroad and came back are kind of like that. She says they hope to do something. Okay. The third one is obviously closely related to that, and that is what I'm calling gender detraditionalization. So this rejection of that narrative that a woman should reorient from self-focus towards family focus on a very set timeline. So I have a quote here from Qin, and I apologize, I'm asking you to read these very quickly, I know, but I've tried to highlight the really key parts in bold text to make that a bit easier. So she said she thinks studying abroad has made her care a bit more about herself. Students in China might get to the age she was then, which was in her late 20s, and with the well-meaning encouragement of their parents, follow the standard steps to get married. But I just don't want to get married, even though she had a boyfriend, right? I want to wait until I've realized my self-value through work before I consider this matter. If I hadn't gone overseas, I might have got married very early. Back then, I tended to see family as my main focus, whereas now I think work is more important. When you go overseas, you have to rely on yourself for everything. So now when you come back, you still want to rely on yourself. Now, Qin was living by herself. She was renting an apartment that she found by herself. And she said her mum and dad are very supportive, but they do pressure her towards marriage, though she says, I take no notice of them. Oh, it's just so free living alone. She just loved it. Because I got used to independent living overseas, I think it's great. Now, that was a very representative statement by the graduates. Okay, so in sum, what I would say, and this is a quote, direct quote from the Dreams of Flight book, from the interviews straight after graduation, what that shows us is that these women were not, by the end of their study, they were really against settling down. Settling down, we got various Chinese terms here, whether it's 定下来, 安定下来, 稳定下来, or even 回家is also another one that's used in the same way. It kind of has, in this sense, three meanings. One is settling down in marriage, as in a temporal settling down as part of the life course. One is a geographic settling in place, but like buying property or staying in the one place. Another one, which I take from the English term settling, is like settling for, kind of compromise. They didn't want to be like friends of theirs that maybe had settled for a boy that they didn't really like, but they just got married to him anyway, right? So in sum, in all three senses, most of the women who participated in the study felt that their experiences of transnational educational mobility had made them less likely to settle anytime soon. Okay, so that's the previous study. The takeaway, in other words, is that I argue they had in a way become more like mobile market subjects. They emerged with an increased suspicion of conventional gender roles. They were moving towards becoming a willingly mobile female labour force suited in terms of their self-understanding and their concrete skills to work in the engine rooms of global capitalism. They had been training to become financiers, various kinds of professionals, various kinds of high-level technicians. This is what global capitalism wants, and we in Australian education had trained them to see themselves this way and to have these skills. And this conclusion supports some prior research findings by other people working in international education in Australia. My examples here are from two colleagues, Aline Courtois and Fazal Rizvi. They've both done different studies on the subjective effects of study abroad, and they both come to similar conclusions, right? So Aline Courtois says it's producing voluntarist attitudes to labour mobility, to the idea that one can be mobile for professional reasons, to see oneself as a flexible entrepreneurial subject. Fazal Rizvi, my colleague at the University of Melbourne, has a similar conclusion in a way. He makes an analysis that our graduates, our international graduates from his interviews, are concerned more with their strategic positioning within the global labour market than with building a moral sense of global solidarity in that sense of cosmopolitanism. So my findings echo these, but with a very gendered dimension insofar as this kind of self-view is interesting because it challenges a kind of gender conservatism that has been on the rise in Chinese society. So I thought that was an interesting added dimension to those research findings. But let's press on. The real question I want to look at today is, what happens next after they graduate? Are these graduates able to realize these hopes they had for ongoing professional mobility? Are they still going to be resistant to settling if we talk to them again several years later after their graduation? And how will they understand and experience that tension between stability and flexibility in this next stage of their adult lives? So that's what I want to look at now. So where are they now, my participants? Take a look at this very quick set of numbers. As of October, as of now, when I'm giving this talk, of my 34 participants who are still in the study, there are 17 in China, 15 in Australia, and 2 in other countries. Their average age, which doesn't really mean much, but just to give you a sense, is about 30 years old. Youngest ones are 26, the eldest is 38. So it's a bit of a spread, but most of them are clustered around kind of 27 to 32, I think. 9 of them have married, or 10 of them have married, but 1 of them have divorced. One of them has divorced. So in other words, a majority of them haven't married at this point. Now, in this latest round of interviews that I've been conducting with participants, this question of settling down has returned with a great force as an ambivalent concept. And this is what I really want to spend the second half of this talk talking about. Questions have arisen in my discussion quite spontaneously, initially without me asking these things, about whether participants see this time in their lives as the right time to settle down. They were wondering, am I already settled or am I not? I'm not sure. Do I even want to settle down, or maybe I want to avoid it permanently? Is it something I should see as a goal, or would it be a disappointing compromise? Can you even settle down? Is it possible? How will you know if and when you are finally settled? Is it maybe a gendered state of mind as much as a geographic or temporal condition? In other words, settling down is a concept that has tendrils out to many other areas of life: geography, money, freedom, family, anxiety, independence, time, security, work, and gender. That's what I want to explore in the rest of our time today. So when we think about settling in the way that I'm using it now in this phase of the study, I think it really has three senses, kind of like the three that I introduced before, but slightly distinct. I've got a slightly different focus this time in the third one. The first one is still time, settling down, as in it's time in my life to settle down, those youthful days of moving around and maybe having, you know, different partners, not a single set married partner. Maybe those days are over. Maybe it's time to settle down in my life course. In space, is it time to make definitive decisions about where I'm going to live and about migration, whether that's international migration to Australia or somewhere else, or whether that's intercity migration within China? Where am I going to be? So it's about space. It's also about emotion and feeling settled or unsettled. And it's that emotional part that I hope will come through in some of the material I'm going to speak with you about now. So in the latest round of interviews, I ended up realizing I needed to ask questions about people's attitudes towards 安定下来, because it just kept coming up spontaneously. So I thought I'll adapt the questions and ask that a bit more directly now. So I started to ask for people's definitions of what settling down would mean. And they gave fairly standard kind of empirical markers in one way. They talked about, some of them said, when you have established your professional career, that will mean you're already settled. Some would say it's about geographic settlement and commitment to a future in a particular place, particular city or a particular country. So it could be geographic. Others named institutional markers, whether that's permanent residency in Australia, a good hukou in China, like in a high tier city, whether it's property purchase, even marriage itself, I guess, can be seen as an institutional marker. Others noted it could be a mental state, an end to anxiety or uncertainty. Some said, I'll be settled when I no longer feel anxious. Interestingly, there are two here that are contradictory. Some people said settling down is establishing one's own family, getting married and having children. Others said, that's a very risky proposition. You never know if you're going to be divorced. You don't know if your husband's trustworthy. You know, I hear all these stories about unhappy marriages. Women's financial independence is what would make me feel settled if I have my own income and my own independence. So these last two are actually in tension with each other, aren't they? I want to now go on to look in a bit more depth at a few different, this is definitions. I now want to think about experiences of settling and not settling. So the first one is a quote from Nyonyo, who's a very interesting participant. I've written a whole article almost dedicated to her in the past because she was so interesting insofar as at the time of her graduation, she was very unsettled. She really wanted to travel the world. She really didn't want to have a standard career. She did not want to get married. She wanted to travel around, have different cultural experiences, go to Mexico, go to Spain, work in low-skilled jobs to enable her to keep traveling and experiencing life like that. So very unconventional. But last time I interviewed her, a little while ago, she has married another migrant man. They've settled down in Melbourne. They've bought a house in the suburbs, and she has a professional job where she's working her way up professionally. She says, now I feel more settled because I don't feel I won't be here in 1 or 2 years because of the visa issue. See, so it's the institutional marker of permanent residency. I don't feel like I'm about to leave at any moment. Before, I felt happy to travel around, but now I feel very restricted. Really, you can't have that kind of life plan at all unless you take leave or win the lottery. I really hope to win the lottery right now. So she was quite ambivalent in that interview. She was enjoying her career. She liked having permanent residency, but she could see that she was restricted by needing to stay on track with the career and kind of needing to, I don't want to say take care of her husband. She sort of gave me the sense that, well, if she were to travel in future, probably her husband would just tag along. I got the impression she was in charge of where they would be, but she was feeling restricted nevertheless. Let's continue. Here's another one. This is Chichi. Now, she's also married. She has a young son who she loves very much, and she very much enjoys motherhood and the feeling of somebody relying on her for his life and support. But the son did arrive a bit sooner than she was really hoping. She's working in Shanghai. She's highly qualified, like all these graduates, but unfortunately she's working in a rather low-skilled job. Her friends and she herself told me it doesn't really have much opportunity for career advancement. She's took the job because it's close to her in-laws' house where she's living in Shanghai. She's not originally from Shanghai, but she's living with her in-laws. And she took this not very good job because it enabled her to care for her son easily because it's in the same neighborhood. So she says, on the surface, I'm settled, but in my heart, I still want to go out again or something. I might go out, not necessarily for work. Maybe I want to go for leisure. It's hard to say. But on the surface, all is very calm. So you see, she's like Neo, she's feeling kind of slightly restricted by this state of settlement. Conversely, Yueming, who's Chichi's best friend, and they were best friends when they were studying in Australia and before, Yueming's state is one of happy unsettlement, right? So she's unmarried. She does have a recent boyfriend. Last time I met her in Shanghai. She's living in Hangzhou, which is not her hometown, with frequent leisure and work travel. She says, I definitely haven't settled down yet because he's only a boyfriend. She's a bit of a joker, so she likes to make light of these things and get a laugh out of her friends. We were chatting in a group when she told me these things. She says, right now, I can't guarantee I'll always be in Hangzhou. I told my boss last week, because our company might have a position opening up in Shanghai. There'll be a branch here. We'll need people to be sent here. I said, will you consider it? She said, oh, yes, I'm definitely going to consider that because her friends are all in Shanghai. And she jokes, if I choose to come to Shanghai, then I'll switch to a Shanghai boyfriend. It's a joke, right? I don't think she was seriously saying that. But, you know, she feels very mobile, very free. I'm not sure whether I'll settle down in Hangzhou in the future or whether I'll always work in the advertising industry. I'm not sure. I said, how do you feel about that uncertainty? She said, it's great because I'm really free. And then she points to her friend, Chichi, and says, she's kind of annoying. I asked her to come out. She says, no. I asked her to go with me to Changsha or somewhere just for the weekend. Just a weekend. Go there on Saturday, come back on Sunday. And she's not okay with it. So Yueming is kind of making fun of her friend's settled state and enjoying unsettlement as freedom. But what I want to look at now is some more complex and ambivalent examples, right? So we've seen examples of pretty clear restriction, feeling of restriction in settlement, pretty clear feeling of freedom in unsettlement. But a lot of the cases are much more ambivalent. So on the left of the screen here, you see a screenshot I did of a WeChat post, which I'm using with the permission of this participant who I call Yuan, who is 27 years old, unmarried, and currently living in Melbourne, working in a sort of a reasonable, sort of medium-skilled job, not a very high-skilled job that's not particularly connected with the area of her major. So she said, and this is just after we saw her. In fact, this photo here is us at our place having dinner. She came over and took a photo. This is just some snapshots from her life. She also worked as a dog walker, like a pet sitter, and was just having a look around campus and taking these pictures. And she says, I've fallen into confused thoughts lately. It must be an anxiety unique to this age, wandering between seeking freedom and envying stability. Can't catch time, yet temporarily imprisoned by one's age. Can only take the solitude of 20 years old, the simplicity of 22, the abandon of 25, and keep exploring forward, right? So she's ambivalent. It's like she's a little bit lost, a little bit caught between times, caught between places. Similarly, or relatedly, May, who's 34 at the time, unmarried and also living in Melbourne, questioned whether settling down is even possible in this world. She said, I think there's actually no way people can settle down because we're always immersed in this river of life. As long as your eyes are open, you're not settled. That's my understanding because life is always, something's always happening. So maybe settlement is impossible in this world of uncertainty. So let's look at some more examples along these lines. If I try to kind of classify the responses I've had around unsettling in being experienced as something that's ambivalent, there's a number of key things that come up. I'm going to look at a few of these in the rest of this talk. One is the sense of a loss of clear goals or passions or direction after study. Like there's too many possibilities and it's hard to make decisions. Secondly, there are, of course, intensified pressures, internal pressures from oneself and external pressures from family and various others to settle down in marriage. Thirdly, this is one I look at, there's a reevaluation of one's former disparagement of married peers in hometowns. And a question of, well, I used to think I was happy and free and she was restricted by her marriage and her conventional life, but now I wonder which of us is truly happier. In relation to the current economic downturn in China, there's tensions around whether you want safe and stable work, say government work or civil service work as security, or do you want an ambitious professional career, which would bring stress, overwork, 996, right, 内卷, and all of those things. And actually, perversely, new gendered pressures to find the best possible position by age 35, because after age 35, it's very hard for women in particular to change professional jobs because they will not be desirable to employers. The question of frequent geographic mobility leading to a loss of social connections. I'm going to talk about that one in more detail. A pervasive anxiety born of chronic uncertainty and this sense of drifting, and even an existential questioning of the possibility of settling down in an uncertain world. So these are the ones, I've now underlined them in blue, which I'm going to look at over the next few slides. Particularly the first three. The fourth one, the existential questioning, will kind of be pervading all of the quotes. Warning, there's some long quotes coming up, but I think they're so rich. I love them so much. I love the way that the participants were able to so generously share with me their thoughts and their experiences. And I can't cut their words because they're so eloquent and what they say is so meaningful. I hope you'll agree with me. So, and be patient while we look at some fairly long quotes in what's coming. I'm going to focus here particularly on two kind of mini case studies of these two young women. They're in a way kind of in similar situations, even though one is living in Melbourne and one is living in China. So first of all, we have Yixin. She's 32. She's unmarried and she's also currently single, as in no partner. She's done a few different jobs. She used to work in advertising. She's now, in recent year or two, started up her own business. It's connected with organic farming. So she's solo running a startup business. That's connected with a passion she developed while she was in Australia for veganism and for organic lifestyles of all kinds. So she's trying to make a business of that, a very difficult road. She finds her business is quite precarious and she feels her direction is quite uncertain in professional terms. She's also very mobile. She's living between Shenzhen and Kunshan, neither of which is her hometown. That is far away. It's quite a small town in northern Guangzhou province. So she's always on the road. When I met her last, we met in, appropriately enough, in Hongqiao railway station. We met up in Shanghai and then we went to Kunshan and then I came back to Shanghai. So it mirrored her life. We had a day on the move in Didi cars and in, different forms of transport, which was like her life. And I interviewed her in this hotel where she often stays in Kunshan. So she's very mobile. And she's interestingly exploring some alternative spirituality practices, New Age self-actualization groups and alternative communities, including in Bali in Indonesia and in Dali in China. The other one who I'm focusing on in these next excerpts is Xingxing. Xingxing is 34 years old. She was, first of all, a participant in my pilot study. So I've known her since 2012, ages. And I've seen her grow up from the age of, I think she was 21 when I first met her, I guess. And she's now about 34. She's also unmarried and currently single. She's also had a lot of different jobs. She worked as an IELTS tutor, a personal fitness trainer, a university administrator, a TAFE lecturer, a casual relief teacher in schools, and now she wants to retrain as a psychological counselor. She's also been mobile. She's recently moved back to Melbourne from where she used to live in Canberra when her relationship unfortunately broke down. She's also far from her hometown, which is a city in Jiangsu province. And she also has been exploring alternative spirituality practices. She's joined a transnational alternative spirituality and meditation group. I'm not going to talk about that today, these alternative spiritual practices, but I think it's kind of interesting. I think it does suggest to us that both of these participants are quite searching for something meaningful in their lives, right? Both of them have taken up these kind of practices, and they're not the only ones in my sample. I'm noticing quite a few of them are talking about various alternative forms of spirituality, but that's probably something for a future paper. So let's think about the first point, this notion of drifting and the loss of goals. All right, so this one is from Xing Xing. I started to ask this question, it's like some participants are really wanting to talk about this notion of settling down or 安定下来. And I wonder what you think about it. Some of them think they have settled down, some haven't. She said, when you said that other participants have this feeling of settling down, I feel amazed. I'm a little surprised because to tell you the truth, I don't know what settling down feels like. I've never experienced that feeling. And in terms of work, I'll tell you, I haven't found anything that makes me feel like I can invest my energy in it and build it up bit by bit. What I'm doing now is not like that. I haven't found such a thing. And I feel I haven't completely found my place in society. When I'm in Melbourne, I've always had such a feeling of drifting, that I've been drifting all along. Right? So she doesn't have that thing that she wants to invest in. She feels directionless and drifting. Such a common sentiment in this recent round of interviews. Similarly, we see with Yixin, different place, different country, different day. She says something very similar. I don't know what decision to make. I feel like my life has reached a point where I can't control it anymore. There's nothing I particularly want. When I was in school, I wanted to learn new things. You feel you're becoming a better person. It's not just work. There's also some meaningful things in your life. You learn new things every day. I want to find that passion for life again now, right? I don't believe in some things as much as before. Like back then, going abroad was the ultimate dream. You just had to do it. And then when you're abroad, stuff happens. You feel a kind of personal heroism. I'm so far away from my family and I can live like this. I definitely couldn't tell my parents about the things I experienced. It was like my life had just begun. But when you come back here, you find this life is like this. And when she continued to speak, when she like this means just plain and dull and boring. And she also said, now that she's back in Melbourne, she felt like her life had just begun. Now that she's back, she says, I feel like I'm yet to begin my life. It's like her life was in Melbourne. It's not at home. She hasn't got the life she wants at home. Again, she's drifting. There's nothing she wants. She doesn't know what direction to take. Okay, the second point here is this one I mentioned earlier of reevaluating married peers, particularly cousins in small hometowns, and the question of who's happier, you or them. So I won't read all this out because it's too long. This one's from Xing Xing, but you get the idea. She went back to her small town home to visit, or well, her family home, to visit relatives and her cousin who was about to get engaged. She was 30 years old. It was pretty interesting. I looked at my cousin's life and my life. They're very different, but would you say I'm happier or she is? It's hard to say. My cousin was born in that small town and was a child and grew up there. When she went to university, she went to a bigger city. Then she missed home working in that big city, so she went back to that little town, and her father found her a government job through family guanxi, which is a very relaxed job, basically doing nothing every day, right? Safe and stable. She could go home for lunch at noon. Her social world was consisting of her parents' home and her work in a very small area. Later, she found her husband in that same small town, so she had her own little home and her husband's home, all in a very small geographic area, right? Remember, it's no longer not mobile. In terms of geographic scope, they were all very close. And grandmother also lives there near the uncle's house, so her circle was all in that little town. And then Xing Xing says, the me of the past Maybe a few years back, I would think it's very boring, too small. But when I look at her now and when I look at myself in Melbourne, I feel lonely sometimes. So I think maybe she's happier than me. I think about myself. My mother's in China and I'm here. I don't have family here. I don't have a husband and I don't have children. Sometimes I feel really lonely and lost, right? So this mimang, I'm translating that as lost, could be confused or directionless, right? It comes up a lot. Similarly, Yixin says something about going back to her hometown. She feels like she doesn't fit in with that whole family. And she says her female cousins, basically they're all married. Even those who are 7 or 8 years younger are already married. They've never left. They've never even worked in the big city. But regardless of what choices they made, at least they're happy. My problem is I'm not happy. And I start having doubts. Their life seems pretty good. Even though I used to say, I don't want to be like them. I don't want to be like them. But you know, they're like that. And it makes me stressed. And then she says, why do many people want to escape abroad? It's precisely because of this. When you reach a certain age, you find that your friends, your relatives, they don't tell you directly, but they kind of think you should get married. And if you don't, you're kind of out of the loop and you start doubting, right? Social disconnection is another big key theme that comes along with mobility. And this was a huge focus in my most recent discussion with Yixin. So she talks about having lost contact because of her mobility and her different way of thinking now with all different groups of people that she used to know in her life. So she says, the friends I do talk to all have children. My single friends, well, I'm not in Shenzhen, so I don't see them very often. And she talks about leaving her hometown, relationship with those friends has changed because, as on the previous slide, it feels I've been continually trying to escape my family and escape that small town. So I've been sort of cutting off those relationships, nothing to talk with them about. I've lost contact. After high school, I went to Hangzhou to study and I didn't have much contact with my junior high school friends. After university, I went back to Guangzhou, then I went to Australia. But my relationship with these friends kind of wasn't really maintained. We just click like on each other's posts. So she's, because of her various forms of mobility, she's become disconnected with these friends groups. And then when she's in Shenzhen, she still feels social disconnection, right? Because, well, number one, she's always traveling back to Kunshan. But number two, she says it's like she wants to settle down, but also doesn't want it. The heart longs for a stable place, a person or a group of friends, to have a sense of community. But I don't know how to find it. I don't know how to participate in things and build that sense of community. And she talks about Shenzhen people like us, that is outsiders, Waidi Ren, right, are not really able to get into the Shenzhen community effectively. My roots aren't there. I find I couldn't fit in. That's why I feel I haven't settled down. I seem to be in a state of wandering. And she says, I don't know how long I've been back in China, but I don't know my neighbors. When I found I couldn't settle down into this community, I couldn't integrate into it, I didn't want to integrate into it, then I was really confused, like, what on earth should I do? So she's feeling very disconnected. And I think, interestingly, this is my last slide with a quote, and then I'll conclude. She talks here about the type of subjective change that occurred along with Australian study. I love the way she puts it. She says, I miss not just Australia, but myself at that time, right? That carefree self, full of hopes. You break yourself down in a strange country, then rebuild yourself. It depends on what your values are, whether you live for experiences, moving around, or stability. If you seek stability, you're a frog in a well. You can be ignorant and happy every day. But once you know the truth, it's hard to go back. How can you build relationships wherever you are so you have a sense of community and friends? That's what they seek in immigrants. You can survive everywhere, right? This flexibility, this notion that you should be able to move and make those connections. So it's about your ability to survive. But it's tough on you if you know there's a different world out there and you try to go home, right? Unless you have a group of people who share the same understanding, it's going to be painful. I find it very emotional to read that. And it was a very emotional day, that day I spent with Yixin. She told me these stories. So this is very much an unfinished story, right? So let's recap very quickly because it's time for me to finish. So I've told you a little bit about how straight after their Australian studies, these young women saw themselves as mobile, professional, worldly citizens who didn't want to settle down anytime soon. Several years later, though, this question of settling has clearly taken on heightened urgency and emotional significance. They're torn between stability and security versus flexibility and mobility. In a way, the situation mirrors that of other young people in other countries in what has been called today's age of uncertainty. And there's the title of a book, Coming of Age in Times of Uncertainty, by a sociologist in Australia, Harry Blatterer, who writes about a whole generation, actually an earlier generation of young Australians, grappling with similar but not quite the same experiences. So I think for my group that I'm working with, this tension between stability and flexibility is especially sharp, even sharper than for other young people elsewhere, because of three things. Number one, an extra fast transition between their parent generation's actual experiences of stability as a realizable ideal, right? Their parents could have a more or less stable career, more or less stable place to live, and so on. But their generation is experiencing extreme uncertainty and kind of compulsory flexibility as young professionals. They're meant to be super flexible in the new market society such as it is now. Secondly, their history of education mobility, as we have seen, had already increased their desires for ongoing mobility and life course flexibility. So that already set them up to want to be flexible and mobile. And thirdly, gender. Again, gendered life course norms mean that they're given less time than men to explore these states of geographic, temporal, and subjective unsettlement, this kind of exploration, this mobility, and so on. And they're under greater pressure to embody stability as a feminine virtue in their adult lives, because we know in every society virtually, women are associated with the household, with providing a stable environment for children and so on. Men are accorded more opportunities to go out, be flexible, be mobile, and so on. So gender is another really key concern then. I'm going to stop now. I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and thank you for listening. We'll now move, I believe, to Q&A.
Well, interesting presentation. Really envious of your research. What research to do? You know, there's no other researchers that could be more interesting than this one. It's fascinating. And no wonder you are so engaged. Who else wouldn't be? So it's really, really interesting. I have many questions, and I do the warm up of the questions, and then audiences, if you have a question, so please put in a Q&A. I'll come back to pick it up. So my first question is because it actually reminds me of this documentary, you know, British documentary 7 Up. So the way you follow them up, and your follow up is in many ways are more interesting in, you know, so are you inspired by that documentary?
Yeah, a lot of people have said that, possibly unconsciously inspired, because I've been watching that. It started to come out when I was maybe like a teenager, and I used to watch it every 7 years when the new episode would come out, and we'd go to a film festival or something and see it. Yeah, maybe unconsciously, but not consciously. A lot of people have asked that. And also somebody actually, I wish I had done this, someone said at the start when I was planning the study, oh, you should get a filmmaker as part of your team, and they could make a film about it. I thought, God, that's such a great idea, but it's so daunting. Like, I don't know how to take a camera crew with all the things I'm going to be doing, and I don't know, the ethics clearance would be even more complicated. It was just a bit too much for me to take on. But I think back now, if only I could have had video of the participants at different stages. Like, I have it in my mind and I have the recordings. And interestingly, sometimes the participants ask me, can I listen to my interview from 10 years ago? Can I listen to the one from 5 years ago? And I'll always send it to them so that they can listen to their previous selves. And I think for them, it's a little bit like 7 Up as well, but and that's the thing about that documentary series, that was for the participants. It enabled them to become reflexive about their own lives. And I think that's very much the case with my study as well, in the sense it gives them a chance to reflect on their experience. And then that in itself, well, makes them more reflexive and gives them really interesting things to talk to me about the next time. So yeah.
Absolutely. And I think as you touched on when you give it the presentation, often you were touched, you were moved. And it is like that story. It's a so real human story. And then they let you in their lives. So it is quite privileged. but you've done such a fantastic job. So my follow-on question is, because you've been doing this for so long, and you know China and the Chinese culture and the Chinese women way back, so you did all of your early studies. So if you compare what you know about the Chinese women in your previous very early studies, including your researches in Taiwan, and the current findings of what you have researched, did those findings surprise you?
Yeah, interesting. I think what this study has really made me aware of is generational change in China. I mean, actually, what's come back to haunt me is my earlier days when I first went to China to study, as you said in your intro, in like the late 1980s and the early 1990s. I was 17 to 19 years old. And I think about the China of that time. Of course, I didn't have a very deep understanding. I was just this young student, But I realize I'm the same age as my participants' mothers almost, or maybe a little bit older or younger in some cases. And it's made me realize, the friends I had back then, we shared a kind of, well, we had quite different understandings of a lot of things, but I think I understood something about my Chinese friends back then, women of my generation. And then I imagine them having, I lost touch with them because we didn't have the internet back then, of course. When I imagine them having children, this would be this generation. And I can imagine, even when I meet their parents, I can understand a little bit about their generational concerns, their anxieties. But then I also get to know the daughter generation. And yeah, so what's different? I mean, I think a lot is different. I mean, the participants will know more than I do about this, but that the sense about a big one is the sense of the normative life course, like the kind of rigidity with which the older generation sees the milestones of what a woman should do and be. The ages that I gave, you're studying, it's time to study. When you finish your studies, you can have a boyfriend. When you graduate from university, you should think about starting to be engaged or like settle on that one boyfriend and then get married. And then you need to have your first child before you turn 30 and so on. That's very recognizable in the parent generation. But the daughters, well, we know even demographically, the statistics tell us they're pushing marriage later, and their first child, they will have it later if they have one at all. So that's a really clear distinction. And I mean, I guess that when I think back to my own earlier experiences, I don't know, we were all young then, like we were kids ourselves, but I can imagine women of that time, holding those attitudes. And I think I empathize with that too. I think it's very confronting also for the parents to see the different directions their daughters are taking. And they grew up in a China where it was very difficult to go overseas when they were young. So I have a lot of empathy for the parents as well. And I speak to them not just once at the beginning, but I've met some of the mothers ongoingly as well. And I can empathize. But I just see that generational contradiction quite a lot.
My next question before I go to the audience, which you didn't mention in your in today's talk, but it could be included in your research, because I've done 500 episodes of a Chinese dating show, 非诚勿扰, if you're the one. So I know a lot about Chinese marriage and dating and relationship thing. So, in China, it's a quite a strong tradition of marrying up.
Yeah.
Girls need to marry up. And that's a very sharp cultural contrast, after I came here. And I was always surprised that Australian girls are quite relaxed about who to marry. So it's not really necessarily about education and all sorts. And marrying up, including education, so you studied overseas, you got higher degree, and then you have to go high up. So do you think that contributed to, in your group, the studies, those participants contributed to them, only 9 and 10 married and then the rest not? Would that be part of the factor?
I think so. I mean, while they were in Australia, they had a strong discourse among them and the wider Chinese student community in Australia that there's no good boys in Australia, like in the Chinese student community. Like the girls are more优秀 than, like, more outstanding than the boys. And then after, which was kind of funny, like we used to joke about it, I thought this can't really be true. Maybe it is, and maybe it's something about Australia and where people send their kids. daughters versus sons, right? Maybe all the amazing boys go to America. I can't believe that's really true, but maybe. But then now they talk to me about, yeah, the difficulty of finding a good match, in the sense that they're so highly educated and they've got all these accomplishments, and they feel a little bit, they don't want to sell themselves short. You know, they have a certain, obviously, self-respect. Yeah, I think it can be a factor, trying to find somebody who can match up to their standards. I mean, we hear a lot about this in Chinese media, right? So these are so-called A women.
Yeah.
And then it's awful, like the hierarchy, but the so-called D men are the other ones who can't find partners because of hypergamy, because of marrying up, that the sides don't match. So yeah, they're very much part of that group that's been talked about a lot in the media, I think. Yeah.
Especially given your initial data, you know, more women came abroad than men. So that just sort of set the equation out of school already.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
So Jocelyn Che, Professor Jocelyn Che has a question. And there is a lot of talk these days about 内卷, which translated as involution. Did the term come up in your interviews? How do you understand it?
Yes, thank you, Professor Che. It did. It can't come up in the most recent round. It's kind of come into prominence in the last few years. Yeah, absolutely. Especially those who are working. 996内卷, all of these kinds of things, so-called 润学, like whether you want to maybe migrate as a way to deal with 内卷. It definitely came up. I mean, those who are very ambitious and work in, particularly in the private sector in China, are extremely stressed out, overworked, 内卷 kind of lifestyle. It's very 卷, the whole thing. So it comes up a lot. And I mean, I guess I understand it as a product of what sociologists have called compressed modernity in China. Like, it's a lot of changes have happened very fast. The economy grew very fast and now is growing less fast, as we know. Urbanization happened very quickly. All of these things have happened very fast and have led to, you know, a particular socioeconomic historical moment where there's this massive pressure in the work world. And it's not just China. We saw it happen, you know, in Japan first. We saw it happen in South Korea and so on. It's a product of this version of capitalism, I think. So yeah, but I mean, it's what's interesting to me about it is the way it propels desires for ongoing mobility and the possibility that maybe a lovely, you know, Australia is known for being a lovely, relaxed, laid back, slightly boring place, good place to retire maybe. But now younger people are thinking, actually, you know, this could be a good place not only to raise children, not only to take care of elderly parents, but actually just to live yourself and get away from involution, get away from that rat race kind of hustle culture that we see increasingly in urban China. Yeah.
My next question is, you know, these girls, these women in your study groups, sounds like they're very open and very willing to open up their lives to you. Did that surprise you? You know, so Chinese in general tend not to tell other people about their private lives. So do you think that also overseas experience has impact on their, you know, like opened up them more than they would?
It could be. I mean, I definitely think studying overseas was a big deal in their lives. It always is. I mean, I know this as someone who studied overseas myself. It's quite life-changing. So of course it must have an influence. Another thing, I mean, this is why I'm so grateful to the resources I was given to do the middle part of the study. Just the amount of time I was able to spend with them, really a lot. I mean, and me talking, I tried to show them that they could trust me, you know, by building up a relationship with them over time. It was a lot of hours. And I showed them that they could call on me for things. I helped them with things in their lives in Australia. So they gradually, over the years, developed this ability to open up and chat with me. And I guess, honestly, the 34 who decided to still participate in the third part of the study, they must want to, right? Because they could have said no. So the ones who didn't, maybe didn't want to keep. Actually, some of them cited privacy concerns and said, I just feel it's like my right to privacy. I don't know if I can keep, telling you everything about my life. It's like, it's fine. No pressure. But those who decided to stay did feel that trust, I suppose, I hope. I think when I gave them the book and they saw, everyone got a copy of the book and they saw their stories in there, and they saw, I hope they saw that I had represented them in ways that were respectful and things, that they then felt reassured. And so, yeah, the most recent round of interviews was so rich. I've just been going through the data. It was like nearly 700 pages of data. They just were so generous. So yeah, for whatever reason, they've been incredibly generous and incredibly open. So I don't know if that's really about being Chinese or not Chinese. I think it's just you spend time with people and you develop trust relationships, and some of them will share things with you. I share things with them too. So yeah, it's been very fulfilling for me as a researcher to be able to be given the privilege to make those relationships, actually. Yeah.
But did that trust, or does that trust, and then the trust is long built and you so cherish because that's crucial. Do you think that can be limiting your research probe?
Maybe. I mean, look, I've never made any claims to being scientific. Like this, you can tell the sample's too small to have any statistical significance, right? It's completely a qualitative study. It's not quantitative at all. So I've never claimed to be like objective, unbiased, scientific researcher. From the beginning, my interventions have shaped their experience in Australia. I mean, and people have observed this, like said to me, surely the fact that you were organizing activities for them will change their sense of acculturation or whatever. It's like, yeah, I know. Of course it does. But for me, that doesn't matter, because I wasn't trying to do a numerical study of, well, how acculturated are they or whatever. I was more just wanting a window into their world. And I do feel I got that window into their world, which to me is more valuable than any possible loss of objectivity, right?
Absolutely. That's exactly why you are doing what you are doing and doing so well. Because you are so clear-minded about what you're doing. My second last question, I can't resist. So this, you did a comparison, especially two women, one stayed in Australia, in China, and one stayed in Australia. You compared them. What do you think in general, like women who who went back to China and women who stayed in Australia in terms of fulfillment or more settled or more, yeah. So is there any to tell you one way or the other or not?
I think it's really interesting. I mean, I do think the numbers are a bit small to generalize from based on geography. What I would say is those participants who are married by now, and especially if they have a child, they all say, I'm settled. That's it, I'm settled. Like, it was very clear to me that if they've done that at that age and, made those commitments, that's pretty clear. Maybe with the exception of Neo, who still kind of wants to go out. Actually, Chi as well. Look, it's never straightforward. So if they've done that in China, they'll feel settled. If they've done that in Australia, they'll feel more or less settled as well. I think it depends. Like I said, there's different markers of settledness. I noticed on my most recent, interviews with participants in China, those who had managed to get hukou in Shanghai, which is a few of them, I could tell by the way they spoke about that was a huge relief to them. It's like, well, now that I've got the hukou, I can relax. They didn't say that was unding, but it's like that's a feeling of having landed, which is a bit like maybe getting permanent residency in Australia, in the sense of, doesn't mean you're necessarily going to stay forever in Australia, but it's ticked off the list. You've got that kind of backstop. That gives a sense of security. So those institutional markers of belonging in a place, a country or a city, that's probably a bigger predictor of who feels settled than which country it is, if you get what I mean.
Absolutely, absolutely. I see you answered very well. Let me get to James Jin question. any equally longitudinal data was collected to their local community connectedness in Australia as a part of an ethnographic scope?
Yeah, thank you, James. Yeah, absolutely. I'm still investigating that. So that's part of the ethnographic work. Well, it's mainly interviews based, but interviews plus digital ethnography. I ask about participants' sense of belonging. In Australia, I've been asking that all along, sense of belonging in Melbourne or whatever city they were in. Some of them ended up going to Canberra or Sydney or Hobart as well. So I ask about local belonging and community connection. I mean, it's impressionistic, right? It's qualitative. I've never endeavored again to sort of do that very social scientific thing where I give them like a Likert scale of how connected are you? How much do you feel you belong on a scale of 1 to 5? It's not really like that. It's more like, tell me a story about, you say you feel connected. Why is it? What is it? What are the things you do every day that make you feel you belong or don't belong? So there's some interesting stories, but there's nothing, you can't graph it or anything like that. But I'm certainly, yes, the short answer is I'm very interested in that question as well. And I've found through the study that this question of mobility versus social connection and local connection in communities, I mean, actually can apply almost equally to those back in China, because I'm sure everyone knows how mobile young professionals and students are in China, right? I mean, how many people are actually living in their hometown? Well, they are, maybe if they are born in a first tier city, but if they weren't born in a first tier city, they probably had some kind of mobility. And therefore having to integrate into new communities and new localities. So it's like the whole generation is in the middle classes and also in the working classes is extremely mobile, on the move. And even some of my participants have said that to me when I say, how do you feel about moving from a very mobile lifestyle to a more settled one? I remember one of my participants said, oh, you mean because I used to be in Australia and now I'm in China, but I don't think it matters, because even if I hadn't been in Australia, I still would have been mobile in China, right? So like it's community connection. I think, as we also see with Yixin's story of feeling disconnected in Shenzhen, like she's in China, but she's not at home. So yeah, it's a complicated question, I think, that community connection question.
Absolutely. I think it's especially given the differences between two countries and the cultures and, Chinese and Australia. It's
Yeah,
almost
true.
moving out. It's like you grow out of your shell and you never be able to get back into the shell. So, Xing's experiences about her cousin happily married and, settled in a small town, and she will never be able to do it. And so it's how they're going to find a life outside the shell that they have grown out of. It's really,
Exactly.
yeah, your next phase of research.
Exactly. You've encapsulated that so well. Thank you. That exactly, like you move away and you change and then you go back, and what do you do? Like, how do you, yeah, I mean, it's in a way, it's an obvious question of like re-culture shock, but I mean, seeing the detail of how that plays out for individuals is very intense. Yeah.
Indeed. So it's enormously interesting talk, and we definitely have to get you back, so interesting. My last question, short one, are you going to write a novel or series of novel?
I don't dare. I'd love to. I'm not a novel writer, though. I mean, I wish I could. Someone should, maybe a novel writer will contact me and want to write a novel out of this. Yeah, someone should, but probably not me, unfortunately.
It will be really, really interesting,
It
so
would be. I want to read it,
yeah.
not write it.
Okay, thank you so much, Fran. We enjoyed it
Thank
thoroughly.
you.
Yes, and it's really interesting talk and discoveries and findings. I hope you keep on doing it, and the next time we hear more about this. So thank you again, and thanks my team and Sally Bowman, who coordinated this talk, and Lindsay Liu designed the banner, and Yenny helped with the tech. So thank you and listeners for joining us. So, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much, Professor, and everybody who helped. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.